Today, XGuard helps fleets take another leap forward to protect their investment, to make life simpler, to never yield to downtime. Introducing the next generation of front-end protection, XGuard, Generation 3.
Welcome to Loaded and Rolling. I'm your host, Thomas Wasson, trucking expert here at FreightWaves. The name of the game today is going to be fleet safety technology, and we're going to be talking to some folks who are using this technology in the form of AI and machine learning to help drivers and fleets stay safer on the roadway. That's going to be a super exciting talk. We're going to be welcoming on our expert here. It is Stefan Heck, CEO of Nauto. Going to be joining us, not only talking about his company, a little bit about some of the statistics and data that's helping them help fleets make informed decisions. Stefan, welcome.
Thank you.
And before we dive in, tell us a little bit about yourself. Nauto's been in the game since I think at least 2014. Tell us some of the foundational story about how it got started.
Yeah, I started Nauto almost 10 years ago now, inspired really by two things. One is I was biking around our neighborhood. I live out in California. And once or twice a week, somebody would nearly run me over. And I started looking at what's causing that. And it was all distraction. People were on their phone, reading newspapers, grooming themselves, talking to kids in the back seat. And I realized that that was a huge risk. And what was interesting is if you look at the government data, particularly from that era, you really couldn't find distraction and cell phones and digital devices as a major cause of collisions. The data at the time showed it's mostly about speeding and drowsiness, hours of service. When in my experience, it was really all people being distracted. And the second was, at that time, there was a lot of interest in computer vision and building autonomous cars. And I think a lot of techno-optimists thought autonomous cars are right around the corner and we'll all be driving one there were some claims around, by 2017, 2018 at the time. We now know, that was a lot of hype. But I got intrigued that you actually could use these computer vision and AI technologies to detect risks and to warn drivers and to help them stay safe. And so that's what we're about, where we analyze, what's going on the road, what's the vehicle doing, what's the historical context of the intersection that you might be crossing. And in real time assessing, are there dangerous situations? Is the driver already aware of them, looking at them, responding to them? And if not, either nudging the driver to make sure they're addressing it, or in the most severe cases, sounding an alarm to help them avoid the collision.
I think that's so fascinating because, there's a real great quote from a Forbes interview you did, looking at it like a co-pilot, because, people are really good at making decisions, but the problem is falling asleep, being distracted, not paying attention. AI is really good at figuring that part out and detecting if you're not lapsing. Is that one of the things that kind of set y'all apart in those early days? Because I do feel like even when I read media as well, everyone just thought we can just replace drivers.
Yeah, that's right. I think people were naive in just thinking they can replace drivers. Turns out driving is a very complicated skill. If you look at the data, it takes a human being about 6 years to master it. Obviously you can get your license faster than that, but if you look at the data of how risky you are, it actually takes 6 years of driving experience before you become a good driver. And by the way, there's still differences between, the average good driver and great drivers. We see some commercial drivers in our fleet customers that have driven for 40 years without having a collision. That's extremely good. I mean, that's phenomenal. They're rock stars. And so the 6 years I'm talking about is getting to be an average good driver. And I think what people underestimated is how complex driving really is. When you talk about four-way stop signs and turn taking, merging onto a highway, responding to road debris, somebody else is reacting, it's really complicated. You have to anticipate what everybody else is going to do and then do something safe in response to that. So that's where humans excel, making judgments about what does this really mean? How's that kid that's entering the roadway going to react? And AI is not that good at those really complicated scenarios. What AI is good, as you just said, is staying awake. AI doesn't fall asleep. AI doesn't get bored. So watching your back, kind of, if you like, making sure you haven't fallen asleep, making sure while you're looking over to the left, there isn't something happening on the right that you need to be aware of. That's what AI is awesome at. And so we're big believers that AI is a tool to support the driver. As you said, a co-pilot, or some people also like to say it's a guardian angel that kind of looks out for you. And really, we're empowering the driver to do what they do best, which is to drive safely.
I like your point about it takes 6 years to get proficient. And I've seen it when my experiences in trucking companies, you have someone brand new, you can drive a car, you may have drove a car for 20 years, but now you introduce an 18-wheeler with 53-foot trailer, the dimensions, and it's like almost learning a brand new thing. When you're talking about that kind of thing in terms of AI as well, a lot of things I hear from people is that providers have said it follows a power law. It's not like an IQ range of a regular distribution. It's more like we need to find out that 20% of the drivers who may need more coaching, or maybe a 20% that are actually causing more of these distractions. Is that something, as well as you're collecting the data, is that something that many folks don't know about when we're trying to think of, well, how do I make this work for my fleet?
Absolutely. I mean, we see a lot of people use kind of what I call the sledgehammer approach. You pick a theme for the year and you say, this year is going to be all about speeding, or this year is going to be all about distraction. And really, that misses a lot of the nuance that you just described, right? So I'll give you 3 examples. If you look at distraction turns out to be really prevalent. We see that 80% of the drivers in our fleets are distracted. And it's shocking how frequent it is. When we first go into a fleet to help them get better, we see 7 distractions per moving hour. In other words, every 9 minutes or so, the driver's either changing the radio, eating food, looking at their phone, whatever it might be doing, reading the morning newspaper. So that's obviously incredibly scary. 7 times per hour is a lot. Now, after a couple of weeks, we see that almost all of the drivers change their behavior, because we give them warnings in these situations where they're distracted, but something dangerous is happening. And we have this very technical term for it, which is we create these experiences of, oh shit. Because if we can get the driver to realize how dangerous it was, that's where they learn and change. And everybody wants to be a good driver. Nobody wants to have a collision. And so by surfacing these risk moments, most of the drivers are changing. And very quickly, 72 hours, 1 or 2 weeks, they know how to be good. And they know what to do. Most of these risks that they're taking are unconscious. If you run a stop sign or you run a red light, for example, most of the time you're not doing it on purpose. You're doing it because you didn't see it. And stop signs in particular can be hidden behind bushes and hard to see. Take that in contrast, though, to something like speeding. We see that only about 20% of drivers in a typical commercial fleet speed. So really talking to everybody about speeding doesn't really solve the problem. You got to talk to that 20% of drivers about speeding. And then drowsiness is even more specific. We see 3 kinds of drowsiness in fleets. The first one is not surprising at all. People that are driving the so-called graveyard shift, right, between midnight and 6 a.m. Yes, you're against the circadian rhythm. People are driving while they are used to sleeping. You see those drivers are heavily drowsy. So overnight fleets need to focus on it. The second one we see is that a very small percentage, less than 1% typically in most fleets, have some kind of sleep disorder, sleep issue. It can be innocent. You might have a new baby. We've all been through that, right? If you have a young kid and they wake up at night screaming, you're not going to get good sleep. But it can be a real medical issue, sleep apnea, or some kind of side effect of a drug they're taking. And that you got to solve through medical treatment and intervention, or get help at night and make sure you get sleep while your baby is up. And then the third kind is interesting. We see it in fleets where the driver's actually doing heavy manual labor. So moving companies, landscapers, where they're out digging, they fall asleep the moment they get into the car. And it's interesting because you don't see that in the typical safety regulation, right? It talks about hours of service and how many hours you can drive. The problem with these people that do heavy labor, they fall asleep in the first 10 minutes of driving. So it isn't about 8 hours or 10 hours. It's about what we're doing right before you got into the vehicle and your body kind of naturally settles. But again, It's very specific. It's not a peanut butter. Every fleet, every driver needs to worry about drowsiness. It's really if you're driving overnight, you get into the car sweaty and exhausted, or you have a medical issue. So we're big believers in sharing that data with the drivers directly, so they can see their own risks. Everybody gets to see their own risk profile and how they can work on it. And as I said, the vast majority of drivers know what to do, fix it themselves. It's really quick. And then the fleet can really focus on a handful of drivers that need other help. Again, it might be, going to see a doctor for eyeglasses. It might be changing to a different route that has a different time of day for them to drive.
I think that's such a fascinating point. I liked what you said earlier, and speaking with you earlier in the past about the impacts of labor. One of the things I saw in dedicated fleets, drivers that had to do driver assist multi stops, was that they kept having the pallets falling on them. And now I'm starting to think, based on what you told me, well, maybe after the first stop, this person didn't get a lot of sleep. They come home nightly, their sleep may be disrupted. And then next thing you know, they don't pay attention, they're careless, some pallets fall on them, or they're tired from the other two stops. So you almost have to rethink the very way you're doing it and have the technology to say, hey, I notice you're at stop 3, you're nodding off. Let's hit the brakes a little bit.
Yeah. No, that's what we do actually in the severe cases where, you get drowsy in the middle of a route. Of course, we alert the driver and say, hey, pull over, take a break. But in some cases, as you said, they're on a schedule. So then we actually notify the supervisor and say, hey, this driver's falling asleep. They need to take a break and you need to send a substitute or, delay the next stop to be safe.
And I think there's a really interesting thing looking at early morning versus late at night. There was some recent telematics data that talked about the most dangerous times of the day to drive. And apparently the hours between 5 and 7 p.m. and then between like 5 a.m. and 7 p.m., the earliest and the latest. Is any of that data as well that you're collecting in circadian rhythm? Is that something where if I'm a fleet, should I proactively send out messages, or now with the technology, I can identify, oh, well, I've got my speeders during this certain time. I can actually target it, kind of like targeted marketing, but with drivers.
It is very much about targeted marketing, and you're really trying to empower the drivers themselves with the right information. You are right. There are these overall patterns. So, driving in the afternoon rush hour is the most dangerous. Morning rush hour is a little bit better. I know everybody sort of thinks, oh, we haven't had our morning coffee yet. I'm probably a worse driver in the morning. But actually, people are paying more attention in the morning than they are late in the day. And then the other thing that can be really dangerous is late Friday and Saturday night. That's where you see people falling asleep, but you also see drunk drivers on the road. And so, if you're driving commercially, try to avoid those hours. I always tell people, even if you're going to see friends, try not to drive Friday at midnight. That's a pretty dangerous time to drive. So not all fleets obviously have a choice of when to schedule, but if you can schedule particularly your urban trips outside of those rush hour times, that can be a huge safety benefit. And we haven't talked about this, but similarly with routes, certain locations, certain intersections are 1,000 times more dangerous than other locations. And so it's very easy if you have, we provide a map that shows you where the incidents are. It's pretty easy for most neighborhoods to find an alternate route. And it isn't always the shortest route. But oftentimes we see that, it might take you 1 minute longer, but cut your risk by 10x. And for most people, that's definitely a trade-off they're willing to make. Give me 1 minute and I save you, 10 times the risk. That's a pretty good trade-off.
Well, kind of segues. That dovetails into one of the things I really like that y'all are working on is the statistical risks and the focus on the long tail. Now, I remember that from Nassam Talib's book, watching about like black swans. Always watch out. It's not the thing you think. It's the thing that's very small, but if it happens, you're really screwed. Talk a little bit about that, because I've seen it firsthand. Fleets focus on the things that really aren't the things that'll take them out.
Yeah, that's right. It's interesting. When we first get into a discussion with a fleet, a lot of times they're worrying about backing into things. And the reason for that is the most common collision if you're driving a van or a truck that doesn't have great rearward visibility. It'll be the most frequent collision incident that you have. But a lot of those collisions, they're at pretty low speed, right? You're not reversing at 60 miles per hour. And secondly, mostly you're backing into a loading dock, a mailbox, a sign. And so it causes damage, but it's not going to be your major incident. And to your point about black swan events, the single largest dollar risk event is when you have a serious injury collision. And sadly, in our the way our economy works, serious injury collisions are even more expensive than fatalities, as sad as those are, um, because you wind up on the hook for medical payments for somebody who struggles the rest of their life. And not to diminish the impact of fatalities. One of the scariest statistics I've come to know in this space, working in this space for the last 10 years, is if you wind up killing somebody on the road, the odds are extremely high there'll be a second fatality in the following year in form of suicide, either of somebody in the family of the person who caused the fatality or in the family of the victim. And so it's a really, really tragic event. These are, very sad, deeply depressing, and of course, multi-million-dollar liabilities. Now, luckily, fatalities are rare, right? You might drive your entire life without being involved in a fatal accident, knock on wood for most of us. But if you have a fleet of thousands of vehicles, you are going to have fatalities. They're statistically rare, but big enough fleet is going to have those incidents. And so that's really where your attention should be. And so how do you avoid those? Well, you've got to go back to the root causes of those fatal and injury accidents. And there's really three main things we see. The first one is running off the road, either because you're drowsy or worst case, because you're drunk, although we don't see that much drunk driving in commercial fleets. And so that's, to our earlier discussion, late night driving, Friday nights, that's something that's really dangerous. The second is crowded intersections in urban areas, particularly right turns where you're not looking at somebody crossing at the crosswalk from the left, or you're watching oncoming traffic and somebody steps off the curb. We see a lot of these clipping incidents, a bicyclist or motorcyclist next to you. So those are really dangerous situations, and you can train for that. We collect what we call near misses, so situations where there was almost a collision. And that is phenomenal awareness and training data to say, hey, look at this example. This was almost a really serious incident. And that gives people that aha experience of, oh, well, I got to watch for that. And then the third is what we already talked about, distraction. Distraction is the number one cause of collisions. In our 1,000 deployments, we've seen that almost 70% of all collisions are due to distraction. So it swamps speeding and every other cause of collisions. And if you can get distraction down, you can actually reduce these really serious injury accidents. So that's the number one place to focus, is really getting people off their phones, getting their hands on the wheel, reminding them, how serious it is. And what people don't realize is that at 65 miles per hour, we see a lot of distractions that are 6-7 seconds or longer. You've got an entire football field without looking at the road, and it's incredibly dangerous. You're 2,300% more dangerous driving without looking at the road like that. And then if there's a pedestrian crossing in front of you, the risk just spikes exponentially. You're thousands of times riskier than normal driving. So your luck's going to run out if you do that.
That was the most interesting thing I heard was for the automatic emergency braking systems on trucks, the lobbying firms that really were concerned with the AARP, because you're so high off the ground, you can't see the old folks walking across the crosswalk. And I never thought that in the trucking, game, we would see the AARP in the older, like the folks representing senior citizens who are in these areas, because that was one thing they mentioned was that they want to have an ability for a truck to stop, because if he can't see over his cab and he's not paying attention, accidentally, I've seen it with them, they'll run into cars too. They're not paying attention.
Yeah, both elderly and kids are really vulnerable because they're not as visible. And so I'm a huge believer that this technology and the automatic braking, automatic warning and detection saves a lot of lives. We measure every collision that we intervene and help prevent. We've helped avoid over 30,000 collisions. And it's harder to know which ones would have led to a fatality, but there are definitely a couple dozen people walking this earth today because we helped somebody else avoid that collision that would have killed them.
So looking at applications as well, fleets are using the telematics and data for insurance costs, showing I am unique, I'm trying this. Your data seven times per hour of instances of distracted per driver. Let's say we drive for 11 hours. That's 77 instances of distraction per driving shift. And if I have a fleet of 1,000, that's what, 77,000 instances per day. Is that something where when you're talking to the clients and customers, do they not really think of, look at the data behind this? It just becomes that probabilistic. It's a probability game at this point if you don't do it right.
That's right. We usually visualize it in a very simple way. We take the total distance driven distracted by the entire fleet, and we show you how far that is. And sometimes it's, New York to California without ever looking at the road. And that kind of freaks people out when you think of it that way. Like, wow, I've driven from New York to... We actually had one fleet, it was a really huge fleet, where it was several trips to the moon and back without looking at the map. Obviously, there's no road, but conceptually. And that's where you really start to freak out and say, wow, I didn't know we were taking that level of risk. And then it's really gratifying. We typically get 90% reduction in these serious long distractions. So you're almost eliminating them. And that is why you get, 2/3 or even 80% reduction in collisions. Again, distraction is the number one cause. So if you solve the distraction problem, you've solved the majority of your collision problem.
So talking about, while we have some time left, it's really the 80% of drivers, when you start showing them these instances and coaching them with the tech, very good progress. Now let's say the 20% that really need the help. Out of that group, is there a similar thing, or is there always kind of like a 20% of the 20% that you just can't? Is there a way to rehabilitate and coach and train, or is it something where once you clearly see the 5 or 6 instances of a behavior, is there any specific challenges with that? Because I've seen it firsthand, but looking at the data, is there hope for those who are the rabbit instead of the turtle on our metaphorical lawnmower?
Yeah. There is hope. The vast majority of that 20% that don't automatically self-improve can become great drivers as well. It takes a little bit longer. It takes supervisor intervention. Sometimes it might take medical treatment. Gave the example, we had a driver who ran stop signs at night, and it turns out he had night blindness. So assigning him to a daytime route completely solved the problem. Right? We had a driver who thought he had learned the right tailgating rule, but his rule was 3 car lengths, and the rule actually is 3 seconds minimum, and you're really supposed to leave 6 seconds, but at least 3 seconds. 3 seconds at 65 miles per hour is more like 11 or 12 car lengths, not 3 car lengths. So once we showed him the right rule of thumb, and he learned how to count, following distance, count 1, 2, 3, he became a good driver. So a lot of these issues can be solved. I will say that, in a large fleet, occasionally you do see, there's what I call a bad apple driver, right? Somebody who just doesn't have the motivation despite all the training and coaching, it just isn't getting it. And then our recommendation is they shouldn't be behind the wheel, right? They may be perfectly good in another role at the company and another job, but they're not in a good position driving a multi-ton truck and endangering themselves and others. But that's rare. We see that, if you've got thousands of drivers, they're all going to be great drivers in a matter of, a couple weeks, and a few might take, a month or two. And then, as you already alluded to, the challenge is you've got all this turnover, right? New drivers are being hired, people quitting to find new jobs. So you constantly have to keep focusing on the new hires and the new drivers. And even simple things like changing the vehicle you're driving or changing the route you're driving can set you back into a higher risk mode. I give the example of, even very experienced drivers, when they start driving for ride sharing, they get in and they have to use the app and they have to find the customer they're picking up. That is a harrowing experience. And so the first month or two of driving for a ride sharing service, you are super risky because you're very distracted. You got to figure out who you're picking up, where you're dropping off. Oftentimes, you're not used to the neighborhood that you're now suddenly in because you're picking somebody up. It can be very, very stressful.
Well, this is some phenomenal information. Stefan, really appreciate you coming on the show. Food for thought as well, because it's the little things that can make a big difference. And if folks want to learn more about Nauto, get in contact, check out what you're working on. What's the best way to find out?
Best way is look on our website, nauto.com. We have a lot of examples. We're happy to do what we call a ride along, where you can experience the technology. It's easy to talk a little bit about what the risks are like this, but the really compelling experience is get in a car with the system in it and see how it has these very sparse interventions only in moments where you really are at high risk. We work very hard to make sure it's not a backseat driver, but it really is there for you as that co-pilot when the risk is high. And people walk out amazed. They go, wow, that was an incredible experience. And that's really what we want. We want people to love the technology. AI gets so much bad rap as a scary thing, but if you use it the right way to empower your own understanding, it's an incredible tool.
Perfect. Seeing is believing. Stefan, thanks so much for coming on the show. Looking forward to seeing what y'all are continuing to work on.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
That's going to be a wrap for this show, but if you're just joining us, you can catch us on demand. We'll be on YouTube, Apple, and Spotify. We also have the Loaded and Rolling newsletter. So if you miss us Tuesdays at 2 p.m. Eastern, subscribe to the newsletter. You will get that in your inbox Thursdays at 2 p.m. Eastern. That's a wrap for this show. Thank y'all so much. Check out the folks at Nauto. Amazing stuff that they're working on. And I will join you next week. We may do it live. We may record it. You'll have to find out. You'll have to check it out.